In the ancient world, where empires rose and fell like desert storms, there was one kingdom that stood at the center of power, wealth, and betrayal: Egypt, a land of golden sands, sacred rivers, and a throne that was never truly safe. For centuries, the pharaohs ruled as gods on earth. But by the time of this story, Egypt was no longer independent in the way it once was. It stood under the shadow of Rome, the most powerful republic the world had ever seen. And yet, inside Egypt itself, a different war was brewing. Not a war of swords alone, but a war of blood, family, and ambition. After the death of Ptolemy the Fiend, Egypt was left to his children. According to his will, the kingdom was to be ruled jointly by Cleopatra VII and her younger brother Ptolemy III. But this was not a peaceful arrangement, because in the royal palace of Alexandria, two rulers meant one thing: conflict. From the very beginning, Cleopatra and her brother were not equals in power, influence, or ambition. Cleopatra was intelligent, educated, and politically sharp. She spoke multiple languages, understood diplomacy, and had a vision for Egypt that went beyond tradition. Ptolemy XIII, however, was young, easily influenced and surrounded by advisors who saw Cleopatra not as a co-ruler, but as a threat. Cleopatra was not just another royal figure. She was different. Unlike many rulers of her time, she was deeply educated. She studied philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and political strategy. She understood something very few rulers did. Power is not only taken by force, it is maintained by intelligence. But intelligence alone does not protect a throne, especially not in a palace filled with betrayal. In the early days of joint rule, Cleopatra tried to maintain balance. She appeared in official ceremonies. She signed decrees alongside her brother, but behind the scenes tension was rising. Because Cleopatra did not intend to stay equal, she intended to rule alone. Inside the royal court of Alexandria, factions began to form. Two groups emerged: the supporters of Cleopatra, the supporters of Ptolemy III. The young king's advisors feared Cleopatra's influence. They believed she would eventually push her brother aside completely, so they acted first. They began isolating Cleopatra from the political council. Her decisions were ignored. Her supporters were removed from power. Slowly, she was being pushed out of authority. But Cleopatra was not the kind of ruler who accepted defeat silently. Instead of resisting directly, she withdrew strategically. And then she prepared. Cleopatra was eventually forced to leave Alexandria. She did not leave as a defeated queen. She left as a strategist. From exile, she began gathering support. She understood something critical. To reclaim the throne of Egypt, she would need more than an army. She would need Rome. Because at that time, Rome was the real power behind Egypt's throne. And any ruler who controlled Rome's favor controlled Egypt. This is where Cleopatra's story transforms from a palace conflict into international political warfare. Rome was not just watching Egypt. Rome was deciding Egypt's fate. Powerful Roman generals and politicians were already influencing Egyptian politics behind the scenes. And Cleopatra knew this better than anyone. She understood a truth that most rulers ignored: a throne is never truly independent when a greater empire exists nearby. So while her brother ruled inside Egypt, Cleopatra was already planning her return through Roman alliance. In the royal palace of Alexandria, Ptolemy III sat on a throne he believed was secure. But beyond Egypt's borders, a queen in exile was preparing her return. And when she came back, Egypt would never be the same again. In the ancient world, kings did not only fall by rebellion, sometimes they fell by alliances, and sometimes by love disguised as politics. While Egypt was tearing itself apart in a silent civil war between siblings, another force was moving closer: Rome. A republic that did not simply observe kingdoms, it absorbed them. And in the heart of Rome stood a man whose decisions could shift the fate of nations: a general, a strategist, and a politician: Julius Caesar. Inside Egypt, the situation had become unstable. After Cleopatra was forced into exile, her brother Ptolemy III remained on the throne. But ruling Egypt was not as simple as wearing a crown. Real power was controlled by advisors, generals, and court officials who constantly fought for influence. The kingdom was divided. One side supported the young king. The other feared Cleopatra's return. But beneath this internal struggle, a bigger problem was rising. Egypt was financially unstable, politically fragile, and heavily dependent on external power. especially Rome. And Rome was watching closely. Rome at this time was not an empire yet in name, but in reality, it already behaved like one. Its armies had expanded influence across the Mediterranean. Its politicians were shaping foreign kingdoms without even stepping into them. And Egypt was one of the most valuable prizes. Why? Because Egypt was rich in grain, strategically located, economically powerful, and politically unstable enough to control. To Rome, Egypt was not just a kingdom, it was an opportunity. From exile, Cleopatra understood something critical. She could not reclaim Egypt by force alone. Her brother had the palace, the army, and the court. But Cleopatra had something more powerful. Strategy. She knew Rome was the key. And in Rome, power was not just held by institutions. It was held by individuals. That is where she decided to make her move. The center of Roman politics stood Julius Caesar, a man who was rising rapidly in influence. Caesar was not just a general. He was a master of political strategy. He understood wars, but more importantly, he understood power. And power, in his world, came from alliances as much as armies. When the Egyptian royal conflict reached Rome, it did not go unnoticed, because Egypt owed debts, and Caesar intended to collect them. The situation in Egypt was presented to Roman leadership as a political dispute between siblings, but Rome saw it differently. They saw instability, and instability in a wealthy kingdom meant opportunity. Instead of choosing a side immediately, Caesar made a decision. He would go to Egypt himself, not as a conqueror, but as a mediator. However, in reality, Caesar rarely entered conflicts without reshaping them. As Roman influence approached, Alexandria became tense. Ptolemy Thing's advisors feared external interference. They believed Cleopatra would try to use Rome to reclaim power. They were not wrong. Inside the royal palace, preparations began for Roman arrival. The atmosphere was heavy. Guards increased. The court became suspicious. And the young king, still inexperienced, was being pushed toward a dangerous path: confrontation. While Egypt prepared for Rome's arrival, Cleopatra was already moving. She could not enter Alexandria openly, so she did something bold. She planned to enter secretly, not as a queen demanding a throne, but as a woman seeking audience. Because Cleopatra understood something most rulers ignored. Power is easiest to influence when it is not guarded. Her goal was simple: reach Caesar before her brother could block her. One of the most famous strategic entries in ancient history. Cleopatra bypassed Egyptian guards and entered Caesar's presence discreetly. Not with an army, not with a royal procession, but with intelligence and timing, she presented herself directly to Caesar. And in that moment, Egypt's political future changed, because Caesar was no longer just observing the conflict. He was now inside it. Caesar listened carefully to both sides of the Egyptian dispute. But Cleopatra had one advantage. She was physically present. She could speak directly. She could argue her case. And more importantly, she understood Caesar's nature. He was not just a ruler. He was a man who respected intelligence, ambition, and boldness. And Cleopatra embodied all three. When Ptolemy III discovered Cleopatra's sudden access to Caesar, panic spread through the court. He realized something dangerous. The balance of power was shifting. Rome was no longer neutral, and Cleopatra was no longer in exile. Now she had something far more powerful than an army. She had Caesar's attention. And in the world of politics, attention is the beginning of control. Inside Alexandria, tensions reached a breaking point. The young king feared betrayal. A queen in exile was returning to power. And in the center of it all, Rome had entered the game. But Caesar had not yet made his final decision. And when he did, Egypt would either be saved or rewritten forever. History is often written as a story of kings and queens. But behind the crowns, there are always armies. And behind armies, there is always blood. When Rome entered Egypt's political crisis, it did not bring peace. It brought pressure. And in the heart of Alexandria, the most dangerous chapter of Cleopatra's life was about to begin. A war inside a palace. A siege that would turn a royal city into a battlefield. Alexandria was no ordinary city. It was the jewel of Egypt, a center of knowledge, trade, and culture. But now its streets were filled with fear. After Cleopatra's secret return and her direct contact with Julius Caesar, the political atmosphere collapsed into chaos. King Ptolemy III and his advisors saw this as betrayal. To them, Cleopatra had not returned as a rightful queen. She had returned with foreign support, and in their eyes, that meant war. Tensions quickly escalated inside the palace. Two factions formed clearly: Cleopatra and her Roman-backed supporters, Ptolemy III and the Egyptian royal army. But this was not a balanced conflict, because Caesar was now physically present in Alexandria, and wherever Rome stood, the balance of power shifted. The young king's advisors made a bold decision. They would remove Caesar's influence by force if necessary, and so the siege began. The royal palace of Alexandria was suddenly turned into a military zone. Egyptian forces surrounded the palace district. Streets were blocked. Water supply routes were threatened. The objective was simple: cut off Caesar and Cleopatra, force surrender. But Caesar was not a man who surrendered easily. Instead, he fortified his position inside the palace complex. What followed was not a traditional battlefield war. It was a siege inside a royal capital. Julius Caesar immediately took command of the situation. He understood the danger clearly. If Alexandria fell into chaos, Roman influence in Egypt would collapse. So he acted fast. He secured key areas of the palace. He controlled access points, and he turned the royal complex into a defensive stronghold. But Caesar also knew something important. This was not just a military conflict. It was a political game, and Cleopatra was at the center of it. Inside the palace, Cleopatra was now physically trapped in the most dangerous environment of her life. But she did not panic, because for her, survival was not just physical, it was political. She understood that if Caesar survived the siege, so would her claim to the throne. And if he fell, she would be at the mercy of her enemies. So Cleopatra stayed close to Caesar's side, not as a prisoner, but as a political ally. As the siege continued, Alexandria became unstable. Skirmishes broke out in streets. Supply routes were cut. Fire spread in certain districts. The palace district became isolated from the rest of the city. Inside, Caesar's forces held ground. Outside, Egyptian forces tightened pressure. It was a deadlock. But deadlocks in war never last forever. Something always breaks. The longer the siege continued, the more political pressure increased on Ptolemy III. His advisors began to doubt the strategy, and Caesar was not responding like a trapped man. He was responding like a commander in control. This created fear inside the Egyptian leadership, because now they realized something. They were not just fighting Cleopatra. They were fighting Rome. During the siege, Cleopatra's position became even more critical. She was no longer just a claimant to the throne. She had become a symbol of legitimacy inside Caesar's camp. Her intelligence and political awareness impressed Roman leadership. She understood diplomacy, timing, and influence. And in a war where strength mattered, so did intelligence. Her survival inside the palace was no accident. It was strategy. The siege intensified. Both sides prepared for escalation. Egyptian forces attempted to tighten the blockade. Roman forces strengthened internal defenses. Neither side was willing to retreat. But the situation was becoming unstable. A single mistake could collapse the entire city into full destruction. And in the middle of this pressure, a young king, Ptolemy III, faced increasing uncertainty. His advisors were divided. His army was stretched, and his enemy was not breaking. Inside Alexandria, the siege had reached its peak. The palace stood surrounded. The city was divided, and Rome stood unshaken at its center. Cleopatra remained inside the most dangerous political storm of her life. Caesar prepared for the next move, and Egypt waited for the moment when the siege would finally break. Because in war, the longest silence is always before the final strike. Wars are not always decided by the strongest army. Sometimes they are decided by hesitation, and sometimes by destiny. In the burning tension of Alexandria, the siege had reached its final stage. Inside the palace, Rome stood firm. Outside, Egypt struggled to maintain control. And at the center of it all, a young king was about to lose everything. The siege of Alexandria had dragged on longer than anyone expected. Julius Caesar had held his position with discipline and strategy, refusing to surrender or retreat. But inside the Egyptian camp, cracks were forming. King Ptolemy III was young, inexperienced, and increasingly isolated. His advisors, once confident in victory, were now divided. Some wanted to continue the siege. Others feared total disaster if Rome fully intervened. Because by now, it was no longer just a local conflict. It had become a confrontation with Roman power itself. Inside the palace, Cleopatra's position had transformed dramatically. She was no longer an exiled queen fighting for survival. She had become a central figure in Caesar's political decision-making environment. Her intelligence, calm behavior, and strategic thinking had made her indispensable in negotiations. She understood something crucial. Power does not always come from the throne. Sometimes it comes from proximity to the throne, and she was now closer to Roman authority than anyone else in Egypt. Caesar began to see the situation differently. At first, he had entered Egypt as a mediator, but now he saw a deeper reality. The young king lacked control. The court was unstable. Cleopatra had stronger legitimacy support, and Egypt needed long-term stability, not temporary rule. Rome did not benefit from chaos. Rome benefited from controlled influence, and Cleopatra represented control. Outside the palace, Egyptian forces attempted one last push. They wanted to break Caesar's position before Rome fully consolidated power. But it was too late. The siege had already shifted psychologically. Roman discipline held firm. Egyptian morale weakened. And inside the palace, Cleopatra remained calm while chaos unfolded around her. She understood that the final outcome was no longer about battlefield strength. It was about political legitimacy. As pressure increased, King Ptolemy III attempted to escape the situation and reorganize forces. But in doing so, he exposed himself. During the chaos of retreat and confusion, he was caught in a situation that would define the end of his rule. Historical accounts describe how his position collapsed during the conflict. Marking the end of his authority, Egypt's internal leadership structure broke apart. The young king's control over Alexandria effectively ended. With her brother's authority broken, Cleopatra was no longer just a claimant. She was the only stable royal figure left in the conflict. Caesar supported her position as the ruling authority of Egypt. This was not just emotional support or alliance. It was political restructuring. Cleopatra was reinstated as ruler of Egypt, now under Roman influence, but with her authority restored. For the first time since her exile, she stood in a position of real power. Egypt did not return to its old independence. Instead, it entered a new phase of history. A phase where Cleopatra ruled as queen. Rome influenced Egyptian politics, and Caesar held strategic authority over regional stability. It was no longer a simple kingdom. It had become part of a larger political system, and Cleopatra understood this clearly. She did not just regain her throne, she secured her survival in a changing world. Many rulers in history win battles. Few win survival. Cleopatra's victory was not just political restoration. It was strategic transformation. She had survived exile, survived civil war, survived Roman intervention, and positioned herself as Egypt's central authority. But more importantly, she had aligned herself with the most powerful force in the known world, Rome. The fires of Alexandria slowly settled. The siege had ended. The palace stood intact but changed forever. Cleopatra walked through the halls of power once again, not as a fugitive, not as an outsider, but as a queen who had survived war, politics, and betrayal. And somewhere in Rome's shadow, a larger story was still unfolding, because this was not the end of Cleopatra's journey. It was only the beginning. The story isn't over yet. Episode 3 will reveal secrets you never expected. Stay tuned.